Greetings, you happily miserable accursed. Happy if you support the bloc. I guess you could call it happiness if you're NDP, and definitely miserable if you're a Liberal this morning. The panel and I are recording this week's Curse a day late, so you could enjoy our by-election breakdown. Lucky you. I'm David Herle. Sad Scott Reid is here. Steady as she goes, Kory Teneycke is here. 1 out of 2 fig leaf. Jordan Leichnitz is here. We'll talk about what last night's results mean going forward into the next session for all the parties. And we'll do it in the context of all the events of the past week in Canadian politics. That'll be a chunk. A heaving, messy, Parliament always on the brink chunk. Our curse cliffing offers a slight change of pace. It's from Kelly Kreiderman at the Globe on the battle between political pragmatism and progressive climate policy. And then, as always, Gordon Pinsett from a place far beyond La Selle Mard Verdun or Elmwood Transcona wraps it up with our hey yous. So, any of you actually stay up to see the results from La Selle last night?
Yeah, before we get to that boring shit, is that Jesse Coulter behind you? Who is that?
No, that's Katie Musgraves.
Oh, okay. Got it.
And somebody wondered who it was last week, and it was Jason Isbell. So there you go. So you want to get to the boring stuff now, Scott?
Yeah, I guess so. Bring it on.
Okay.
3 a.m. No, I did not stay up and watch. I knew what the result was going to be, and I decided that I would go to bed and wake up and see how I felt about it. And the answer was badly.
Jordan, did you wait up?
I waited until I could be relatively sure of Elmwood Transcona, and then I conked out. I'm getting old. My blood pressure can't handle. I need to just wait until the morning. Nothing good comes from fretting over it. It'll be there in the morning.
All right, Jordan, I'm going to start with you because the NDP were the only party actively engaged in both of these by-elections. And so what did we learn?
Well, I think we learned they got game. That's, when you have... so Singh has been out saying...
Who? Sorry.
Yeah.
Singh's been
Atlanta?
out saying... Yeah. Been out saying that he's ready to call an election. He's ready to fight one. And boy, you got to be able to prove that. And so that's why I think on top of some of the obvious reasons why Elmwood Transcona was a do or die for the party, it also was going to show really what chops the party has in those blue-orange fights that are going to be so important. So I think last night was quite good, actually. Obviously would have been better if they'd taken La Selle Verdun, but the fact that they showed a strong, they were up 7 points there, it was very close. That was a good fight, and the margin was bigger than I would have guessed in Elmwood Transcona. They were able to pull that off. I think it shows that they've got some chops on the ground.
So wait, Elmwood Transcona, let's just take this for a second, because, this is a riding that you won by 20 points. The NDP won by 20 points in the last election. But what I can tell, and it's early in the morning, but the NDP vote held, but everything else collapsed to the Conservatives.
Yeah,
right? The Liberal vote disappeared,
right.
PPC vote disappeared.
I think vaporized is the word you're looking for, yeah. And it all coalesced around the Conservatives. And I think maybe I would just add a little bit. So on the
But if that riding's close because of that.
That riding is also has a unique factor too, right? Which is the Blaikie factor. And I think you can't completely discount that. So that being Bill Blaikie's very long time riding, followed by, Daniel Blaikie. So the NDP actually lost that riding during the Orange Wave in 2011. And that was another moment where you had, obviously you had some cresting Conservative support and you had a candidate who wasn't a Blaikie. So seeing some similar conditions in this by-election absolutely was rightly concerning, I think, for the party. So it was good to see them come out on top for that. And I think, the Tories threw everything they had at it. So it was a good, real dogfight. And the fact that the NDP was able to come out on top, I think it speaks very well to their ground game. And I think it's also a bit of payoff for what Singh did with confidence and supply agreement.
Okay. Kory, what do you see in these two by-elections?
Well, first I'm going to say bullshit on
Good morning, Kory. I just want to point out that the old, so Kory, Conservatives won 0 by-elections last night, but
Okay, well, the conservative vote went up massively in Elmwood Transcona. You had a 21-point margin last time. Where did that go? Like, this is not good news. And I think in a general election, I'll make a bet right now that the Conservatives will win that seat in a general election. But do or die for the NDP, not do or die for the Conservatives. Conservatives are walking out of that, I think, feeling pretty good. And if I were in an NDP caucus, I would be very concerned that one of the safest seats in the country had its margin essentially wiped out. The margin of victory, like this would be like if the Liberals had won in LaSalle and them cheering about how great it was that they had a victory. That's kind of what's going on.
All the anti-ADP vote consolidated. Like,
if I could just jump in, there is one difference. I mean, the Liberal vote collapsed in LaSalle Verdun, right? The NDP vote held in Elmwood Transcona. It just almost wasn't enough, but it held at its level.
It's still declined, but I think what that says for other seats on the prairies and I would say also if you were to go east of there into Northern Ontario, and if you were to go east of that into like the Windsor area, like I think this is very bad news for the NDP. I think it shows that even in these traditional ridings, they've been able to become a very strong force in a way that they haven't been in the past. Like, look, the Conservatives won this by like a point in 2011 in a very special set of circumstances, but that's an anomaly. This is a safe NDP seat, and it's not a safe NDP seat anymore. Like this would be like if the Conservatives won by a point in Lethbridge. Would you be dancing around cheering? I know that Singh likes to Bhangra dance every time he loses half his seats, and maybe this is another example of that. But I don't look at those numbers and say one should be happy. If you were to look back to like 2015, the by-election in Souris, where the Conservatives, safe Conservative seat, Conservatives barely won the seat.
Brandon Souris, right?
Yeah, Brandon Souris. And we were I was there at the time. We're congratulating ourselves for having pulled off a victory, even though it was very close. And really what it was a harbinger of what was coming at us in 2015.
Ottawa-Vanier. Can I say Ottawa-Vanier in 20... right?
Right. So look, you can look at that and spin yourself into being happy, but I don't think there's a lot to be happy about in it. But let's move on to the other one. That is a seat that the Liberals must win. Like, these are the safest, much like St. Paul's, one of the safest seats in the entire fucking country. And to lose it is a real problem, obviously. And I'm sure you guys will talk more about that. But I want to point out something. They barely lost, right? It's 300 vote margin, whatever it is. Very, very slim margin. Can you imagine what would happen if the Prime Minister had decided to chase votes in that riding instead of, chasing other things at TIFF parties? I got to say that, that's like a few pots of coffee away from being able to win. And, I don't think when you don't have the Prime Minister there actually pushing it, that you're really putting in a full effort. And I think if they put in a full effort, they probably would have won. Like, it's that close.
Well, they must have determined that the risk was too high of having him associated with it because they didn't think he could deliver it. But him not being able to deliver it is a story in itself.
Either way you look at it, I guess you can see a lot of things. But whenever you see, I don't know about you guys, but when you lose a riding by a couple hundred votes, you can find a couple hundred votes all kinds of places. And I guess where none of them are, on a red carpet at fucking TIFF. That's where none of those votes are. Like, it's I think a huge mistake for them not to have thrown everything into it. I think, but what does that denote? It denotes a defeatist attitude, and maybe some delusion on their part. Like, but we can get to that more later, because I think there's lots to talk about vis-a-vis the caucus retreat that is perplexing and bizarre.
We'll get to it. Don't worry. Scott, pretty much the only positive for the Liberals that I can see is that they lost to the Bloc instead of the NDP in Montreal.
Yeah, that's about it. That is about it.
You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I'm like Liberal campaigners. People can't hear me. Look, there's nothing to take from it if you're the Liberals, like zero. And, there was an attempt with the National Caucus, with the resumption of Parliament, to almost sort of pre-discount this loss. You could almost feel them looking past and talking past it. No one said we expect to lose or anything like that. No one tried to explicitly diminish expectations, but you could just see them sort of talking like, our backs are against the wall, our dukes are up. The brand new message you're getting from us is, by God, we're right, and we're going to fight our way out of this corner. And it's time that people took a good hard look at that son of a gun that's running the Conservative Party, and don't sleep on us, because we're going to crack you one across the jaw. Okay. That was in some ways kind of looking past the by-election. It almost conceded like, we don't expect to win this by-election, and they didn't win the by-election. It's been a bookend of bad, a bookend of historic, humbling, and concerning bad for the Prime Minister. You started the summer with the Toronto St. Paul's by-election loss, and now you end it with a loss in Montreal in the Salle-Mart. And, both of those are safe Liberal ridings. Both of those ridings tell us that there's virtually, we're now down to what, 15 seats that the Liberals can say there are absolutely no sweat. Like, other than that, it's like we're going to have to work like sons of bitches just to save ridings that we assume are safe. Now you're on mute, Dave.
What ridings would those be?
Well, like
Ottawa-Vanier.
Ottawa-Vanier, Ottawa South, like maybe not even Ottawa South. I don't know. Don't challenge me on that. I'll probably lose that discussion. Right. But yeah, it's so, and this is why, in a weird way, I think the big loser, this is going to sound like spin. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Jordan, but I think in a weird way, the big loser tonight was Jagmeet Singh. And here's why. Because the Liberals are like, they're not going to change. They're not doing anything different. They're going to keep plowing away. And Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, by winning that riding and holding on, and because their vote did hold, they will avoid asking themselves the X-ray question of, wait a second. If the Liberals are going to keep losing safe ridings, if they're going to refuse to change course, refuse to change message, refuse to change leaders, refuse to change policies, then we have an historic opportunity to slide back into second place and leapfrog these guys. And for the love of Christ, we cannot afford to do anything but maximize that opportunity. And Jagmeet Singh is going to undermine our ability to maximize that opportunity. He's going to drag. We can't blow this chance. We can't be sure it will come around again. And Winnipeg Transcona means that they will not have that penetrating internal discussion, and he will lead in the next election. And I think you're going to be fighting to hang on to ridings like Winnipeg Transcona. None of that is to deflect from the dismal circumstance that the Liberal Party finds itself in, that continues to find itself in. But I think in a weird way, it would have been to the NDP's benefit to have an argument about, are we 100% sure we don't want to take a tumble, see if somebody else might compete for more seats, and not really compete with the Conservatives, but slide past the Liberals in this next election. Like, if Trudeau's going to stay, and if they're not going to do anything different, and if they're going to walk into machine gun fire and say, all right, against your bullets, I'm going to throw punches.
Then let's put Notley up against them. See if we can wipe them out.
Exactly. I think you guys are ignoring facts on the ground here. Listen, Kory, when the Conservatives are polling over 40% in the horse race numbers nationally in a by-election,
45.
That's right. If they can't wall up the
almost
NDP
90
that you claim is so weak in this riding, with
this
a
is one of your
union member as a candidate, I'm not
safest
done.
ridings. You've been talking a lot.
Every last dollar that they have, all their money bags into this, if they cannot take that from the NDP, you are not going to persuade me that that's some sort of signal of their strength on the ground. I'm sorry, it's not. It's really not. And to Scott's point, look, I think the answer is that actually Singh is performing better than all of his many detractors here would suggest. That is what is borne out last night. That is what is borne out last night in vote
He does not have the Blakey name to carry him in riding after riding.
I think, and we're going to talk more about this later, they are making, like, the party is making moves and changes. Ones I would point out that the Liberal government has been unwilling to make.
That's a fair point. You guys are playing cards. You guys are playing cards.
Let's move on. I just want to say my last thing on the by-elections, and I'll direct this to you, Scott, particularly.
Yeah, great.
Is that one of the things that bugs me about the Liberal Party is that it's going to talk endlessly about LaSalle and Mart Verdun. And the amount of reflection on the fact that we got 5% of the vote in Winnipeg is not going to get much reflection. But that's pretty fucking amazing.
Yeah. No, it's...
Well, there's so many things that we could talk about because, you know, I hope we find our way to the carbon tax reversal and David Eby too, because there's a lot there.
That's our clipping
to go through.
That's our clipping today. But how the hell does a governing party get 5% of the vote in a by-election? It's pretty amazing.
Well,
all right.
There are a bunch of things, right? You know, you keep pushing a carbon tax that nobody wants. You know, Scott, I gotta set you up to deliver your line. You had such a pithy line on our group chat about the latest group to come out against the carbon tax was the atmosphere itself.
That's right.
Clouds. I laughed out loud. I gotta say, I laughed out loud.
All right. We're going to use this space this week to report on a growing problem, Herle-Burleyites, that poses a real and present danger. I introduced the subject once before, almost a year ago, but frankly, it's gotten worse since then. The issue is copper theft, and I want to talk about it not only on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS, who quite obviously has a vested interest in all of this, but also as a public service message. Here's what's happening out there. Because of the rising price of the metal, more and more thieves are targeting copper wiring and other copper components from utility poles, substations, and construction sites. Then they resell it. That causes widespread havoc. Imagine for a moment, you're at home and your loved one starts experiencing a sharp pain to their chest. You pick up the landline, no dial tone. You rush for your cell phone thinking you'll have service, but there isn't any. And it's not just 911 services that can go dark from copper theft. A lack of connection can stop your business dead in its tracks, or even delay submitting your school assignment on time. There are other issues too. Costly repairs to infrastructure, broader power outages create dangerous conditions for utility workers and the public, and an economic burden that extends beyond the price of repair. There are opportunity costs that impact local economies, as well as increased operating costs. So, pretty clear it's a serious problem, one that requires a multifaceted, collaborative approach to address effectively. From a public point of view, be vigilant in a common sense way. If you see suspicious activity around areas with copper infrastructure, report it to authorities. Do not confront these thieves directly. Talk to others about how copper theft impacts public safety and infrastructure. From a policy point of view, strengthened legislation is going to help mitigate the issue. From a TELUS point of view, they're investing in increased drone surveillance and predictive software, other measures too. And they thank you all for listening. Let's move on to these caucus retreats that have perhaps maybe even more significance than these by-elections do. Both the NDP and the Liberals held their retreats last week. They didn't spell out either one of them to the public what their comeback strategies would be, and you wouldn't expect them to. I guess the NDP had unveiled theirs earlier by exiting the confidence agreement and backing away from the carbon tax. That seems to be the foundation of what their play and move are going to be. The Liberals didn't make any policy changes, Scott. I want to go to you right now, but they did come out with this new aggressive tone. Trudeau unleashed. Aggressive tone with their opponents. They're going to call them names. They're going to really lay into them on social media, I presume, and in news conferences, because we still have no evidence of paid advertising. So what do you think of this new offensive?
Look, there's a logic to it in the sense that, okay, it more or less concedes we are We are down. So now we're going to actually try to embrace the role of underdog, put our dukes up, try to fight past it. There's a little bit of a hint of the 1979 gunslinger campaign, although it's not quite as isolated around Justin Trudeau as it was isolated around Pierre Trudeau. So you can see a logic, but the overwhelming logic, and can we light a candle for the people that have to do comms? You know, everyone's like, oh man, you know, our policies are very popular. People, once they look at Poilievre, are not going to like what they see. The real problem isn't what we're doing, it's how we're failing to communicate it. It's like, we got a great story, we're just not getting it out there. That is literally the gun barrel conversation all communications professionals have to put up with. So when you're offered no change in leadership, no change in team, no change in policy, no change in direction, all that's left available to you is a slight change, shift in tone, and that's all this is. And so, you know, look, I would concede that the Prime Minister, when you actually look and listen to him, he sounds good, he sounds sharp, he sounds in fighting form and all of that. But gravity is gravity, man, and it is what it is. And I think that you can change nothing and avoid the same thing happening over and over again. Like it's maddening. And so, you know, from my perspective, I'll just get this out here now. I'll take one more second. I thought the most interesting thing that happened in the last 2-3 weeks was Carney. And I know everybody rolls their eyes.
Can you hold it? I want to get to that discrete segment. Hold it.
All right.
Kory, I want to go to you, and I want to ask you about the aggressiveness of Liberal communications recently, and how you think that might play out for them.
Well, I'm not sure what to say about it. Like, I just think it's so disconnected from reality. It's like, you know, what's the saying? All thrust, no vector. Like, sound and fury, intensity. But
somebody said that to me once. I don't remember her name, but it was. but like, you know, sure, like, you know, amping up the intensity of your messaging and sharpening it up, sure, but like, you know, what's the message? Like, I'm still perplexed as to what the focal point is, and there's such obvious problems with what's going on with the government that seemingly everyone except one person has come to the obvious answer on, and I guess we're going to get to that in the next section, but literally, even as Scott pointed out, the atmosphere has given up on the consumer carbon tax, but you know, the Liberals haven't. So, like, as long as you're continuing to you know, sell shit and tell everyone it smells like roses, you're going to have trouble. And it doesn't matter how, you know, angry and sharp and aggressive you are in selling that message. I just don't think it takes you anywhere. But surely they're not naive enough or innocent enough to believe that if more people understood that there was a pharmacare program, that the situation would change. I think people are just done with Trudeau on a personal level, and I think everyone can see it except him and maybe a handful of enablers or folks around him who are so close to it that they've lost perspective themselves. But like, everyone else could see it. It's in every poll and every focus group. It's on every doorstep. You know, if you want to listen for it, it's there. But you know what's not going to fix it? And I just feel, I was so like gobsmacked by this little bit of color that came out in Althea Raj's piece of playing clips to caucus of Rocky and the Al Pacino speech from Any Given Sunday. Like it, I don't know, like, whether to shake my head or, you know, cry a small tear or like what. It's just that is just so kind of condescending and inappropriate, and you know, I don't know what else to say. Oh, but actually, I know that Nicole had the best line that I heard, which is they should have been playing Braveheart, because at least that movie ends with the protagonist being disemboweled in front of a cheering crowd. Like, that would have probably been more appropriate to what's actually going to be coming their way. But you know, I don't know. It just was flabbergasted at that.
I definitely think the Rudy strategy has its limitations in the real world.
It's not Hollywood.
It's
not Friday Night Lights, guys.
I mean, you'd have to start from the assumption in the real world, Sylvester Stallone would have beat Apollo Creed, and he wouldn't have.
Right.
So, all right. So at the moment, Jordan, I'm going to go to you. The Liberals have two sacred cows they won't sacrifice. Trudeau himself and the carbon tax. Assuming those two conditions hold, what would a political strategy for the Liberals look like?
I don't know. I mean, I think if those two things hold, I don't see a path back for them. The main problem with their current attempts to dig out of the ditch that they're in is that they change none of the fundamentals. People are done listening to the Prime Minister. So even if you buy the theory that the programs and the things that Liberals have put in place are popular and not enough people know about them, it doesn't matter because nobody is listening to your salesperson. The same goes for this fresh strategy about being chippier. I think that's a good thing to do. I thought Gould sounded pretty good yesterday. I don't mind any of those things, but they're primarily playing to themselves as an audience because there's nothing paid behind it. It's not going anywhere. It's just sort of vanishing into the bubble. So it will probably have an effect of making caucus and folks feel energized and like they have something good to rally around, but it really won't do a whole lot more than that unless they put money behind some of these things. You saw yesterday, there was also a bit of an effort at counter-programming. So they went out on some of the mortgage changes the same day. Look, also, again, not bad that, the content, fine, but you're putting Freeland out to sell this, which again is someone that people have lost confidence in as a messenger and nobody is listening to. So I think that there's clearly some thought there about how to rearrange the communications deck chairs. But without shifting any of these fundamentals, all of that is just going to go down the drain. There's no real opportunity to pivot on any of these weak points without shifting one of those two fundamental things. That's my view.
Yeah, well, fair enough. So down in Clinton, Ontario, an hour north of London, there's a place called Slowman Park, and in it sits a single rail car. It's a strange little rail car, unlike anything in the CN fleet to which it once belonged. When you step inside this meticulously restored bit of railway history, which you can easily do because it's open to the public for visits, you'd swear you just stepped into a school classroom, and that would be because you did. For more than 40 years, from 1926 to 1967, it and 6 other rail cars like it rolled round northern Ontario, reaching students in remote mining towns. The rail cars delivered basic education in 5-day sessions once a month. They brought medicine and supplies. They even dispensed civics lessons to first-generation immigrants working in the deeps. The teachers in the school cars, as they were known, lived on the trains with their families. One of the most dedicated was Fred Slowman, the teacher on school car number 1. Slowman was a pedagogical nomad most of his life, traveling between Sudbury, Capreol, and Foylet. He and his wife Seela raised 5 children aboard the trains. There's a picture in the Ontario archives that captures the harshness and the hope of the time. A group of kids trooping out of a solitary icicle-encrusted school car, wading through deep snow, clutching their book bags. When the school cars moved on to the next towns, Slowman and his fellow teachers would leave students with 3 weeks of homework. It's a completely Canadian story, and it happened on the rail lines of our sponsor, CN. Fred Slowman was an ordinary Canadian hero, and now he has a public park in Clinton named after him, with his school car parked in it. He deserves to be remembered. Kory, I throw the same question to you. Given those circumstances, what could a Liberal strategy look like? And I'll just throw this into the mix. At 45% nationally, they've got to be getting now the votes of people who don't really agree with their worldview. Can there not be wedges thrown into that somewhere?
Well, but there's a glue that unites it, right? Like, I think this is why such an obvious strategy is to change leadership, because the defining element that cobbles some of those people who don't share other elements of the worldview is a fatigue isn't even the right word. Like, it's past fatigue. It's like bordering on, some sort of violent rage in some cases against Trudeau. And as long as he's there, that's the glue that holds the coalition together, I think, for the Conservatives at that level of support. I think there's a very stable Conservative coalition in this country, and in the 30 to 35% range, that you see in election after election, almost irrespective of leadership or policy set that you put forward. But to get that extra 5 points to 40 or 10 points, which Poilievre has now, you start adding in folks who are not necessarily long-term or natural allies. But what's uniting them? It's the two things that you identified. It is a desire to get rid of the carbon tax and blaming it. Not just blaming it. I think it's become the symbol for the affordability crisis and the symbol for a government that just isn't hearing what people are saying and just doesn't get it. And really is on this now standing alone. And I would say not just the Liberal Party standing alone, I'd say the Prime Minister is standing alone. Because I think if you were to change the leadership to literally anyone other than maybe Stephen Guilbeault in that cabinet, they would get rid of a carbon tax as their first act as a leader. So it's really one person with one idea that is so stubborn and so dug in. If going back and forth with folks on this stuff in the caucus meeting, your former panelist and our mutual friend Jenny Byrne pointed out to me that the authentic Trudeau is actually the worst version of Trudeau to be trotting out right now. He's like condescending and stubborn and tone deaf, and all of those things that are really what the problem is. Like, I think they need less authentic Trudeau. I think they need something that is actually bowing and bending to the will of the public on some of these things that are really driving votes away from them at an alarming rate.
All right, Scott. So let's say I said to you, these are the two givens. We're not moving on the carbon tax. We're not changing our leader. You got to get us to 30% support. What would you do?
There's only one option left, and that's to go with a flamethrower at Poilievre. And so you see,
I think you need a money thrower.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, obviously, since that wasn't taken off the table with David's preconditions, I'd be doing a direct appeal saying we need money to finance a hardcore program. But I see no alternative to it. I think, let me pull together a couple of threads of the conversation. I think you can make a strange case in a bubble universe that the Liberals have been outstanding in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Outstanding insofar as, if all that's left to them is to fight with what they've got, then I do think Karina Gold was compelling in playing the underdog, and I'm going to put the boots to Poilievre. I think that the Prime Minister has performed fairly persuasively at the microphones. I do think they've had some smart counter-programming issues where they sort of make news with 30-year AMs, and they actually made some changes that made some sense there, allowing first-time home buyers to buy. So all of it, they're kind of, in a weird way, within the monstrously weighty constraints that they've put themselves in, they're actually executing okay. But even if all I was left with was a negative flamethrower campaign against Poilievre, I'm not going to be heard by anyone doing a news conference at 9:15 in front of the doors of the House of Commons as Karina Gould. No one is listening. No one will hear. No one is going to get connected to. And so that's, that's the challenge. I mean, that's the sum total. That is the story of this summer. It started with the loss of Toronto St. Paul's, and they were clearly shaken, and they looked around and they thought about it, and they decided, we will do none of the things that represent change. We won't change personnel. We won't change leader. We won't change policy. We won't change the carbon tax. We're not changing anything. And so then they turn to the poor fucking comm staff and say, first of all, this is your fault because the pollsters tell us that what we do is well liked. And second of all, you've got to you have to make this garden grow. But I'm not going to give you any fertilizer or rain. I'm just going to tell you to stand in the garden and scream at the rose bush and say, bloom, bloom, you motherfucker.
Well, but the fundamental problem with trying to drive a leadership wedge is that it is a comparative wedge, right? Like, when you're trying to go after somebody on leadership, it inevitably invites a leadership comparison. And I think this is at the core of what's not working for both Trudeau and Singh, is they are not an appealing alternative in comparison right now. Like, people do not dislike Pierre Poilievre as much as hardcore folks in the Liberal caucus and maybe in the NDP caucus really dislike him. You don't see the level of dislike that you normally see for just a garden variety conservative candidate. Like, if you just went in and plucked out, one of the last 4 or 5 leaders for the Conservative Party, they all have worse numbers than Poilievre does. And but it invites a comparison, and the reality is you have some pretty unappealing people that you're comparing him to, and no one more unappealing in the country, probably in its history, until you go back as far as Brian Mulroney, than Justin Trudeau right now. So you can attack Poilievre all you want, but as long as the other alternative that you're comparing to implicitly is the prime minister, he's going to win. He wins that beauty contest 10 times out of 10.
Well, I think, though, we can't really know because they're not attacking Poilievre potentially all they want, right? Like, there still has not been a major paid effort to go negative on Poilievre. So we don't know what that does, right? Because nobody
doesn't make it still doesn't make the prime minister more appealing, and you're inviting a leadership comparison. True. You're inviting a leadership comparison that
I think that's a secondary problem for the Liberals at this stage.
Yeah.
They're connected. They're tied together inherently.
Yeah, but David's told me I can't take that bridge. So all I'm left with is blowing up yours.
If there's one thing I know, we can ignore the questions that are asked us in interviews. It's like the first thing we teach candidates, you guys. Come on.
No, but Kory, everybody who's talking to Trudeau is coming away convinced that he is determined to run. Now, that I believe that view will still change. But after his dad got 5% of the vote in the Mission Port Moody by-election in 1983, it took him another 9 months to get his head around leaving. So that may or may not, if it happens late. As well,
I suspect you're right, but we've been saying that for a long time. Like, I think next summer is the time that it's most likely to occur, if it's going to occur.
So what should they be doing for the next year other than sitting around and waiting? I mean, they're going to get some good economic news. They're going to get lower interest rates. They're going to get, hopefully, some more economic activity.
Those are leading indicators of what's going to happen later. But as we've talked about before, like, when 1993 rolled around, the economy was pulling well out of the recession, and it didn't make anyone feel any better about the Conservative Party. Like, the hangover from high interest rates and increasing cost of living will extend long past better news around interest rates. As people are renegotiating their mortgage, they're dealing with higher prices now, and they're pissed at the government, and it'll be quite some time past those things subsiding from their high point before people start feeling better about things.
Yeah, Jordan.
There's only one alternative left, David, and I don't know how you would execute it. I don't know how you would draw it up. And if I work within your constraints, and if I accept at least some of what Kory is saying, which is that any attempt to draw a leadership contrast is going to harm you, then what you have to do with the next year is rehabilitate Trudeau's image. You have to rehabilitate Trudeau's connection with voters. You have to find a way, and I'm not suggesting that this is easy or simple or even possible, but given the constraints of the thought game we're playing here, you would have to have Trudeau run into a burning building and save some babies, do something where the whole country said, Jesus Christ, that is admirable. And that is going to force me to rethink my impressions of this guy and try to reignite the warmth I once had for him. I mean, at some point, if he's not leaving, then you have to make him, you can't hide him and you can't work around him. So you have to change what people feel about him. I don't know how to do that, but that's the only route left available.
Trust is one of those interpretive and abstract words. We can't buy it at a store or put it in our pocket, but most of us feel it when it's there and when it's not. Canadians put a large measure of trust in our banks. It's where we keep our hard-earned money, save for that first home, or set aside for our kids' education. Over 99% of adult Canadians have an account with a financial institution. almost everyone you know. And with that kind of responsibility, banks know they've got to have your back. Banks also serve close to 3 million self-employed folks and small to medium-sized businesses across Canada, helping them grow and thrive. That's a lot of people relying on the same trust and support you count on every day. With over 280,000 Canadians working in banking, this commitment runs deep, right from your local branch to the folks working in the background who keep everything ticking. It's not just about individual success, it's about powering our country. Whether you're paying your bills online from the comfort of your couch, planning that dream vacation, or just managing day-to-day expenses, your bank has to be there, working behind the scenes to make sure everything runs smoothly and securely. So the next time you make a financial decision, big or small, know that Canada's banks appreciate your trust and are dedicated to return it. For all the essential information about Canada's banks, visit cba.ca. Jordan, do you have, in many respects, the Conservatives are so running away with this election that in many respects, the progressive primary, if you will, is the more interesting contest to focus on, with the Liberals down in the low 20s. And nobody has been a stronger advocate for negative advertising against Poilievre than I have been, from the second he was elected leader. But now that the Liberals are in this position where they're at like 21, 22 points, listen, this is a lesson I learned the very fucking hard way, is if you drive votes away from Poilievre, it is not certain they come to you, right? And is it possible now that a Liberal negative advertising campaign could actually vault the NDP into second place?
Yeah, it absolutely is. But the catch-22 for the Liberals is that you also they will not be able to rise without a negative campaign against Poilievre. They need it. It's an essential component of any type of turnaround. So they're caught on that. They have to run that risk, and it is a serious risk when you have outside of Quebec, you've got a statistical tie for the parties. Yeah. And I do think that that's a real challenge for them. But honestly, I think that that's not what's holding them back right now, because it is such it's a bar they have to get over before any of these other things that they're pouring into at this point could potentially have any liftoff. And so I don't think it's driving that decision.
Well, okay. So I'll try to take a better stab at answering your question genuinely, because I think it's building on what Scott mentioned. You got to increase his positives for sure. Some of that you can do through party advertising. I'll build on Jenny's point that the Trudeau Unplugged is the least appealing version of Trudeau. Totally. Like, I think they have to probably tone down the amount of shit talking that he's doing, the amount of accusations and negativity that's coming out of his mouth. Like, when you're already that ill thought of by that large a part of the electorate, and including people who voted for you in the past, you got to get closer to the brand of the version of you that they liked. The version of Trudeau that people liked was Sunny Ways. The version of Trudeau that was on brand for him was a lot more positive person than he's been, since, if you go back to the O'Toole election. Like, I think that's really where it pivoted, and where he was, calling the unvaccinated Nazis essentially, and going really hard negative in a way that was more combative than I'd seen him in any of his earlier iterations of himself. Like, I think he's got to back off that. And I think the other thing they need to do is start doing government advertising, which is, I would say, in terms of volume and amount of money that you would spend, outstrips what you can do with party advertising about 10 to 1, right? Like, it's just such an important strategic tool to be using to put out a
spectacular Ontario government ad during all the sports I was watching this weekend. It's beautiful.
Well, I don't think you would see the Ontario PC party where it is in the polls if it wasn't out telling its own story in a positive way using government advertising. Do you think that the carbon tax would be the policy pariah that it is if they'd spent time and money actually communicating it to people in a positive way? And they haven't. Like, all of the communications around the carbon tax have been done by the Conservative Party, and very effectively. But, the government has, that's a water gun. in terms of advertising dollars. The fire hose is what governments can do. They can use the fire hose. And they just chose not to. They unilaterally disarmed, and now they're suffering the consequences.
Just to add to what Kory is saying, I think one of the risks in terms of strategy that we're seeing for the Liberals coming out of the caucus retreat, the punchiness, is exactly what he's talking about in terms of reinforcing what people don't like about the Prime Minister. And I watched him in question period yesterday, and I think like that tone it's actually not helpful for him right now. He does have strong people within cabinet who can carry that, who can be fighters. And I think that that's a fine and good tactic for them. But I think that they should be considering a different tone for him. And just to go back more seriously to the parameters that you put on the discussion, David, I think that even if they're not going to scrap the carbon tax, another option is, of course, some sort of a pause or a freeze. Something to take the cudgel a little bit out of the hands of the Conservatives on that. A little pause, just a little.
Like when your friends say, you know what?
We're just going to have a pause.
Andrew and I aren't breaking up. We're just going to take a little pause. We're going to move into other apartments. We're going to screw other people. And then we're going to, I'm sure we'll come back to it. But we're going to pause.
Take a little break.
That always works.
But then to Kory's point about the government advertising, yes, I wholeheartedly agree with what he says. And I'm sure we'll talk about it more about the lack of government advertising around carbon tax being a really major factor in it becoming so radioactive. But there's also major limits in how effective government advertising is going to be at the federal level because the government tied its own hands on that now. So these are not going to be the same types of ads that you're seeing in Ontario. And I think that there should be maybe caution on the part of
nobody can even be wearing red underwear.
That's right. Like you can't even be thinking red box, right? So, which don't get me wrong, I'm wholesheartedly in favor of those types of reasonable limits. But it is going to really limit how much that can work for them.
Yeah. Hey, Scott, I want to come to you with one last thing on the caucuses before we move on to this carbon tax thing.
Okay.
Obviously, one of the most interesting things about the Liberal caucus was the unveiling of Mark Carney as a advisor, platform drafter, economic guru to the Prime Minister directly. So what role could Carney play in this strategy we're talking about getting the party back into some level of contention? And is it possible that a genuine red book thing could provide the government with some forward-looking ambition that might make a difference?
Probably not. I think it's a really consequential move, though. I think it's far more significant and important than people have given it credit for. I think most people just dismiss it. It's a party task force, not bring him into cabinet, whatever. Got him through a day. They were able to talk about the economy for a day. Carney got on TV. People weren't just saying to the Prime Minister, how soon before you quit. But I think there's actually, I'll come at your question a little bit differently, David. I think what's going to happen is almost obvious and inevitable. And I think it's going to matter a lot. And seems to me that Mark Carney, who has spent a lot of time in the past, well, not just last couple of years, but, has dedicated himself pretty thoroughly to thinking about how the worlds of finance and economics and public policy and climate come together. I think it's been pretty obvious for the past year that he's very uncomfortable and taken, and this hails to our clipping that's coming, he gets that the consumer carbon tax is an anchor that has to be cut loose. And so it seems to me that Carney is almost inevitably going to use this platform that's been provided by the party to come back and chart a course to move away from the carbon tax, try to substitute some other policy remedy that allows the party to square the circle of saying, we are going to walk away from the carbon tax, but we're going to maintain our credentials on climate, and that we are going to try to break this connection that we ourselves have invented and cemented, which is that one is the same as the other. And he's going to do that, and one of two things are going to happen. Either it's going to be an off-ramp for the Prime Minister and the cabinet to say, all right, let's go this way and we will take this route. We'll pick it up and champion it, and we'll get away from this thing before the April 1st hike, or the government will get jammed with it, and they will refuse to do it. And then Carney will have, as a potential future leadership candidate, either before or after an election, he will have established himself ahead of almost any other potential candidate as having distanced himself in what would presumably be a somewhat coherent, thoughtful way from the consumer carbon tax. So I think it kind of works for Carney either way. Either he brings the government away from it, or he positions himself when that remedy is rejected as the guy who has a better answer. And that is a real strength for him in any future leadership contest. So I like, how is that not going to happen? What is Carney going to do? He's going to come back and talk about productivity and how to upskill our workers? No, he's going to come back and deal with the fucking carbon tax.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's talk about the carbon tax. We have a clipping today, and it comes from Kelly Kreiderman in the Globe and Mail. Here's an excerpt. She was talking about the U.S. Democratic Convention at which climate change was barely mentioned. And she says the Democrats aren't going to back away from their signature climate law, the Inflation Reduction Act, but the fact climate change received scant attention at the Democratic National Convention last month was not an accident. Because of politics or pragmatism, there's a reckoning playing out in the world of climate policy for progressive politicians. In Canada, it was seen in the carbon tax reversals last week by NDP leader Jagmeet Singh and British Columbia's David Eby. Mr. Singh continued his months-long muddled backing away from a consumer fuel charge in its current form. And Mr. Eby is the NDP premier of a province that prides itself on its environmental bona fides. But he faces a tough election in October and now says he would eliminate the levy if Ottawa drops its own policy. The NDP leaders are responding to a shift in the public mood in the past 2 or 3 years. The cost of living and housing means for many there's less bandwidth for environmental concern. In the U.S., some Democrats who once demonized their own oil and gas industries now appear to accept that it's necessary, or at least value the jobs numbers in swing states. This has all come about, at least in part, because of messaging from Pierre Poilievre, who doesn't fret about the climate and has fought the consumer carbon tax at every turn. But conservatives are leading in the polls because they have successfully captured the mood of the times. If environmental policies add to the burden of people already squeezed by their bills, there's going to be pushback. The Liberals have made their position worse, with the constant refrain that the carbon price and annual hikes have almost no effect on most households in the economy, their frequent dismissal of the economic and energy security benefits of the oil and natural gas sector, and their politicization of how the price was applied across the country. And they haven't yet yielded from their position like NDPers. But it's increasingly clear the consumer carbon tax price is on borrowed time. And that will force Canadian leaders to come up with new energy and climate policies, hopefully ones that combine pragmatism and public support with emissions reductions. That also means Mr. Poilievre will soon have to come up with a plan beyond axe the tax. All right, Kory, time for a victory lap on this subject. You're obviously not surprised that all of this has come to pass.
No, I'm not. I also have to say the baloney factory line from Eby. Just sometimes you get a good quote and then it comes back to bite you in the ass in a very big way. And I think that's an example. Not surprised, in fact, in part because bologna is a lot like hot dogs, and hot dogs, as you know, is the greatest food on earth. And so if something is bologna, it's probably going to taste better than what he's been trying to feed people.
Wait, what do you have against kale? Really?
Look, you don't win friends with salad. That's always been true. But look, no one buys that there's a magical tax that you pay and somehow you end up better off. Like the premise of the carbon tax is always, I think, being ill-founded. What it's trying to do, I think, is ill-founded. There's a case, a very egg-heady economics case to be made around incenting consumer behavior, et cetera, using the carbon price to do so. But you got to have the technology and the infrastructure in place to allow people to make a choice that leads them to, the better environmental outcomes you're looking for. And we're just not there yet. Like, this is a policy that's time has not come. So I think it's been ill-conceived since the get-go. I think the other thing that's been really working against them in all of this is you see so many other jurisdictions around the world going much further in terms of meeting their climate targets and not using a carbon tax. And so this message that there's only one way to do it, and that's a carbon tax. And if you don't support a carbon tax, you hate the environment. Well, I don't know. The United States is doing a lot better than Canada, and they're not using a carbon tax. So I just think the whole thing doesn't hang together. And I think it's also what we talked about earlier. If you don't actually go out and sell something, like if you don't sell the rebates, if you don't sell all of that on the front end, you're setting yourself up to really allow your opponents to define it for you. And you can look at so many other issues where that's happened. You could look at the pipeline debate, for instance, where you had large energy companies that basically just sat on the sidelines until public opinion was firmly established against them, and then they decided to try to put an oar in the water, and it was too little, too late. It's a version of that, and we've seen it a number of times before, and that same outcome is playing out before our eyes.
But oddly, Kreiderman concludes by suggesting that Poilievre will have to come up with a more substantive plan, which I find an odd conclusion to the article, because the rest of the article makes the case that that's not true.
Yeah, well, because I don't know, maybe she's trying to find balance and include the sort of talking points of the government and the NDP. I don't know, but there is nothing in terms of the research that I see that would indicate that that's the case. People want the government focused on affordability issues. They blame the carbon tax for some of the affordability issues that they're dealing with. Has become a symbol of that fight. It's not that no one cares about the environment. Lots of conservative voters care about the environment and climate change. They just don't see a connection between a carbon tax and a better environmental outcome for all the reasons that I mentioned. So, saying that you need to have another policy, bullshit. Show me the evidence. Show me the polling that says that's at all true. It's just not. That's wishful thinking. It's not actual opinion research. That's the basis of that statement.
Scott, what do you think there's any benefit to the Liberals now from being the only party defending this policy? You have a time set on this show that they should take any policy that has 30% support and grab it, because they don't have 30% support. I bet the carbon tax has 30% support.
Yeah, I'm really worried that logic is actually going to be articulated internally. I'm really worried that they're going to literally, it's kind of like, well, if I'm in a dungeon, then let's make dinner from dirt and pretend that we like it. But
it's not dirt. That brown stuff on the floor, it's not dirt. It's not
just because Eby and Singh have abandoned the carbon tax now, that is telling you what Kelly's telling you in her piece. And by the way, she's a great writer. Plugging away there with her stuff from Alberta, week after week, year after year. I really think the lesson, and let's pick up on her piece exactly at the end of it. I mean, we've trod this ground a million times, even again today, saying, the big challenge for the Liberals is that for a number of years, they tried and they established a logic that now chains them up, that now handcuffs them, which is that if you care about the environment, you must support the carbon tax. And now to abandon the carbon tax would be effectively a confession that they no longer care for the environment. I would make the opposite argument. I would borrow her last paragraph, and I would say that it is now apparent that you cannot win votes with the carbon tax. I think that's been obvious for some time. But also, I think, increasingly, the political argument is you cannot place pressure on Pierre Poilievre to present an environmental plan. You can't get a tag on him as long as you're carrying the carbon tax. Once you've articulated an alternative to the carbon tax, and as creaky as it is and as late as it is to be saying, you know what, you can be committed to climate without necessarily embracing the consumer carbon tax, and here's our alternative. As uncomfortable as that going to be, and how much better it would have been if they'd done it a year or a year and a half ago, at least it will then allow you to say, now then, what is your plan? Until that, you're not even going to have the opportunity. You don't have the stakes. You don't have the credibility. You don't have the standing to turn and say to Poilievre, produce your plan. What's your plan? Because as long as he can say, my plan is fuck off to your carbon tax, it doesn't do anything for the environment and it harms people in terms of their cost of living struggle, that it's game, set, match.
Well, all this notion of you need to have a plan on the environment and roll all of that out. Like Aaron O'Toole bought that hook, line, and sinker. How did that work for him? You know, the Doug Ford plan, as you'll recall, David, was cap and trade. Cap taxes, trade Kathleen Wynne. We also talked about cleaning up litter in parks, planting some trees, and, not polluting generally, right? Like,
wood and snow shovels. We're going to use wood and snow shovels, people. That's Doug Ford's plan to protect the environment.
But, it's the notion that you can't win in Ontario and you can't get votes in Toronto and all of those things that you heard, in that sort of O'Toole era, that you must do in order to get a majority of votes, or a plurality of votes rather, for a Conservative Party in Ontario. None of that turned out to be true. It was all bullshit.
I used to regularly lecture Jenny on this point and how they needed to have an acceptable climate plan to the broad mass of Canadians. And I was wrong. I was just flat out fucking wrong. And I'm more wrong today than I was then, because the arse has completely come out of climate change as a public policy imperative right now for Canadians, not for the atmosphere. I don't think the atmosphere is where Canadians are at on this, but Jordan, there are obviously some real lessons here about where Canadian climate policy is going to go in the future. And I suspect what we're headed toward is zero sacrifice, right?
Yeah, I mean, or maybe at least hidden sacrifice, right? I think that there's these moves.
That's my favorite sort of sacrifice.
Yeah, your favorite. You just where you don't. It's all just baked in to the general sacrifice that is your life, right? Yeah, and I mean, I've been on the record earlier here saying that I think that it was the right move for the NDP to go away from the consumer carbon tax as a policy. I think it was an inevitable move. There's really not an infinite number of levers on this, right? So, and a world without a consumer carbon tax, we largely know what that would look like. You would make up that difference, which now is like around, say, 10% of the emissions reductions. You would make it up with more stringent industry limits, with regulations, with investments. You can close that gap some other ways. Now, I can hear the Economist Party on Twitter screaming, because it is not maybe the most economically efficient way to do it. But nonetheless, we've politicked our way into a place where this is the only politically viable policy. So that's what will happen, right? And I think that the lesson here is really, and a lot of it is in what Kory said, in failing to in any way sell the carbon tax as a policy to Canadians, over really 8 years, the Liberals have sealed its doom here. It is now, I think, irredeemable.
That wouldn't have been easy to do, by the way. Let's not leave the impression that would have been an easy thing to do. It's a complicated policy that's counterintuitive for people, right?
I agree. However, there were elementary basics that were not done, right? Like, you did not physically get those checks for 8 years, right? Like, you did not, there were really basic things that were not done around it, that could have been done, that could have softened the blow, and potentially also prevented this from becoming a flashpoint. But that has now happened. And it is not the sum total of action on climate change in Canada. And in fact, I think the ease with which EB has now backed away from it really tells that story too. Like, BC still has Canada's leading climate policy, and that hasn't changed. And they're able to do that and walk away from it because the consumer carbon tax now actually does such a relatively small proportion of the heavy lifting. So that's, I think, where the actual policy piece is going to go. Politically, I think, and I think obviously particularly for the NDP, what they need to do is, going forward, ideally after the BC and Saskatchewan elections, not in the middle of them. We don't need to have a debate about new forms of carbon policy while those campaigns are ongoing. But it's to talk about what is a way to do this, and a proposal that's focused on who should be paying for carbon pollution, right? And then, come up with a thesis, go ahead on that. And ideally,
Can I stop you? Can I just stop you? If you're watching Kamala Harris, and I know the two countries aren't the same, but if you're watching Kamala Harris, why wouldn't you come to the conclusion that you don't need to talk about climate at all to amp up the progressive voter base? There's so many other issues that animate the progressive voter base that climate change has too many downsides as an issue to be part of your mix. Like, they're just not talking about it, right?
I think it as a political issue for progressives right now in Canada is best viewed as a bar to get over and not a place to linger. And so I think that progressive parties need to show that they have a plan that has some sort of a path towards where we need to go. And then they need to stop talking about it and move back to core affordability issues. Right. And actually, and my critique around, I think, particularly Singh's moves on this over the last week, I think it's the right place to go. I don't like how he did it. I think it was clunky. I think he presented a broadside to the Liberals to punch at the NDP. I think that there's definitely better ways that it could have been done. But I also can't argue with the results in terms of the by-elections, right?
Right. I just think the EB thing was a real shock.
Well, how do you think that went down? Because they happened on the same day. Was it EB calling Singh and saying, "Hey, look, I'm going to abandon this. Do you want to do it with me or not?" But I don't believe that turtle got on the fence post all on its own. That happened with some level of coordination. That was deliberate.
I don't believe in coincidence, Kory.
Yeah. All right, I think it's time for our Hey Yous. Mr. Pinsent, would you assemble the crowd?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Hey, who wants to go first?
I can go.
All right, Scott.
My Hey You is to my family and friends, the voters in the Bay of Quinte, my hometown, Belleville, Prince Edward County area. You got a by-election this coming Thursday, provincial by-election. I genuinely like and admire Todd Smith. He's left politics. Degree to which you can pull a by-election provincially, who knows what the numbers really are, but there's a suggestion that this is a neck-and-neck race. Sean Kelly is a local candidate. I think he's got a fetching chance of winning. Really fetching chance.
How is there a by-election on Thursday? Didn't fucking Todd Smith just resign 3 days ago?
I know, because the people that run this Ford machine, right? They're so fucking caught up in themselves. They snap call this thing thinking, well, we can put it in the basket and brand it sold. Don't worry, we're good. I think they're going to get a little bit of a shot across the ribs. I think the voters are going to come out and give Ford a bit of a surprise. I think Sean Kelly's going to get elected. He'll be a great MPP. So go Sean, go Liberals, and Fubi on Ford for taking the people of Bay of Quinte for granted.
My Hey BU, just the opposite of everything you just said.
Can we just have a moment? That was the most spirited, partisan Liberal I've seen Scott in, a year.
But he's been staring at his screen so intently, I thought he was taking either an SAT or a Myers-Briggs test or something. But turns out he was just researching Bay of Quinte politics.
That's
Finding
right.
out the candidate's name and the rest.
All right, Jordan. Hey, you.
So my Hey You is I guess it's a small one, but there was a very sparsely attended, but I think important take note debate last night in the House of Commons, and I just wanted to Hey You out to the MPs that took some time to go and speak. There's been 6 Indigenous people in Canada who've been killed in interactions with police in the last 2 weeks. That's fucked up. We have a problem. Haven't been hearing much about that from near anybody. And I know there was a lot of other more exciting political news last night, but Hey You to those who took some time to turn out and talk about that in the House last night.
All right. Well done. Thank you. Kory?
Well, we talked about it a lot on the front end, but I'm going to throw my Hey You to Colin Reynolds and the Conservative Party team out in Elmwood, Transcona, and say, keep it up, keep working. You're going to win it in the general. And I think you put in a hell of a fight, hell of an effort, and just keep going. ID vote and get it out.
All right. My Hey You goes out. And the concept of the Hey You is not that you love the person that you're hey-youing, not that you necessarily support the person that you're hey-youing, but that you are acknowledging something that the person that you are hey-youing did.
Oh my God, is this about Evita Peron?
No, this is, I'm going to say, my hey-you goes out to Pierre Poilievre because he has taken on 3 issues: inflation, safe supply of drugs, and the carbon tax, and won them so decisively that he has forced all the other political actors to react to him, turn their backs on long sworn policies. I'm struggling to remember when there's been an opposition leader who was having such an effect on policy at the federal and provincial levels around the country. It's pretty amazing what he's done, and it's been very skillfully done. And I don't probably like where it's all going to end up, but boy, formidable politically. All right, there you go. With a heavy sigh, I say that. And now I'd like to thank everybody who watched or listened to the show. I'd like to thank the 3 of you for appearing with me. I would like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN and the Canadian Bankers Association. And we'll see you all next week if we can continue to remain upright. We'll see you all next week for more of the Curse of Politics. In the meantime, take care of yourselves.